Good evening. I would be presenting to you the psychological and biological factors of sexual behavior. So, to make things easier, I have divided the discussion into two parts, which is the sexual desire and sexual activity, wherein sexual desire is defined as the sum of forces that lean us toward and pushes us away from sexual behavior. So, this is basically the motivation or drive to do sexual activities. And sexual activity is defined as the physical process of engaging in sexual acts and intercourse. So, sexual activity and sexual desire is actually categorized into two types. The dyadic sexual desire or activity and the solitary sexual desire and activity, wherein the dyadic is mostly done with a partner and solitary is done alone. So, the first biological factor that we would discuss in terms of sexual desire is the brain, which is the structure that translates the nerve impulses from the skin into pleasurable sensations. It controls nerves and muscles used during sexual behavior. So, the brain also regulates the release of hormones, which will also be discussed later on. So, there are parts of the brain where sexual desire, or it helps people to trigger sexual desire. So, some parts being the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outer part of the brain, which allows thinking and reasoning. So, parts such as the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cingulate gyrus, and septal area are all parts of the limbic system, which plays a role in sexual desire because this is the part of the brain where emotions and feelings are believed to originate. And lastly, the hypothalamus is also an important part of the brain for sexual functioning. It is a small area in the brain which receives signal from the limbic system, and research has shown that destruction of certain areas of the hypothalamus can cause loss of sexual behavior. So the next biological factor is hormones, or is believed to be the physiological origin of sexual desires. So hormones are produced by the endocrine system and regulates physiological and behavioral activities. So in this part, particularly sex hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, they typically regulate motivation to engage in sexual behavior. And hormones such as vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin in male is involved in the arousal stage and is increased during erectile response and is directly associated with increase of motivation to engage in sexual behavior. And oxytocin in female is known as the cuddle hormone or love hormone, and is produced when people cuddle or snuggle up or bonding socially, and is also produced during intercourse. So next, we will be discussing the psychological factors of sexual desire. So alongside biological factors, of course, there are also psychological factors. First being gender identity, which is defined as or refers to one's sense of being male or female. So this means that it is basically the gender that the person mostly corresponds with. So, for example, I may be female, but I most likely correspond to being a male. So that is what gender identity is. And then sexual orientation is the emotional and erotic attraction towards another individual. So this is basically somewhat the sexual preference that that people have towards their partners. And sometimes people do get gender identity and sexual orientation confused because So, for example, just to make things clear, for example, I am female. That is my gender identity, but my sexual orientation is also female, or the preference I have towards my partner is also female. So this is where the heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual categories or um, um, go in, or those kinds of classifications go in. So the next is, also, sexual orientation is not a choice, but rather it is a relatively stable characteristic of a person that cannot be changed. So the next psychological factor is sociocultural influences, which refers to the differences of definition of gender identity and gender orientation in various cultures. So, issues relating to sexual orientation and gender identity is very much influenced by socio-cultural factors. Things as mentioned before, like sexual orientation and gender identity, depends on the norm of or the culture of the country. So, for example, in New Guinea, the norm there that there is a particular age in the boys' development wherein they're only allowed to have or establish a relationship with a guy. So again, it depends on the norm of the country or the place that you are in. And lastly, psychological state. Psychological factors play a central role in sexual desire. So research has shown links between emotional disorders such as depression, anxiety, and OCD to sexual desire. So a research done by Carvalho and Nobre in 2011 showed that people with emotional disorder are typically less motivated to have sexual activities. So next, we would be discussing the biological factors of sexual activity. So the sexual response cycle is done by Masters and Johnson and happens to both dyadic and solitary sexual activities, and is referred to as the series of physical and emotional phases that occur when an individual becomes aroused or engaged in sexual stimulation. So the first phase or the first stage is the excitement stage, wherein this is the beginning of the arousal. So these are the things that usually happen during the stage. Myotonia, which is the muscle tension increases. Heart rate and blood pressure increase. Vascongestion happens, which is the increase in blood flow towards the genitals. Vaginal lubrication and erection of penis occur. So the next stage is the tattoo stage, or sexual excitement continues to grow. So in this part, the female clitoris becomes highly sensitive and retracts. The outer third of the vagina becomes especially engorged, and male testes withdraw into scrotum. So it is important to note here that muscles during the plateau stage, muscle tension spasms continue. So in the orgasm stage, or the climactic shortest phase, this is where muscle tension releases. In a female, the vaginal muscle contract and the uterus undergoes repeated contraction. In a male, repeated contraction occur on the base of the penis and semen is ejaculated. And lastly, in the resolution stage, wherein the body slowly returns to its original unexcited stage or state, the body parts return to their normal size and hue. Some of the changes occur rapidly, whereas others take more time. So, in males, there is a period called the refractory period. This typically occurs to male and is defined as the length of time during which men cannot get aroused from any sexual stimulation. So the refractory period depends from person to person. So in refractory, the refractory period of female is quicker than the male, because I don't know if you have observed that in females, they would tend to they would have the tendency to have more orgasms than men in during sexual intercourse. So as compared to men, wherein once they have orgasm, then that's it, and that's their refractory period. And lastly, we will discuss the psychological factors of sexual activity. So according to Beck, Bozeman, and Qualtrough, sexual desire does not technically result to sexual activity. So in the research, it has shown that it doesn't mean that a person or a person does not technically associate sexual desire with sexual activity. So for example, you can have sexual activities with a person without having sexual desires towards them. So as mentioned before, there are two types of sexual activities, which is the dyadic sexual desire and activity and solitary sexual desire and activity. So according to research, people with low dyadic sexual desire and activity have high avoidance, motivation, insecure attachment, and poor mindfulness. And people with low solitary sexual desire and activity have high scores for approach motivation and relatively low scores for avoidance motivation, relatively secure attachment, highly mindfulness, and among men, good self-control. And people with high dyadic sexual desire have high approach motivation, secure attachment, have high self-control, and have high mindfulness. And in terms of people having high solitary sexual desire and activity, the results are actually different from male to female. So in male that have high solitary sexual desire or activity has lower satisfaction with mental health and life in general, as compared to female that are in solitary sexual activities or do solitary sexual activity, have higher self-esteem and better sexual health. So that's it. That is the report. Thank you for listening and have a good night.